All right. So, in this episode, we're going to talk about a few things. We're basically going to address this article that I just contributed to for the Atlanta Constitutional Journal in terms of capital and fundraising, and really my struggles and what it's been like to raise funds in Atlanta versus being in Silicon Valley where I was before. So, in the Valley, there is just kind of an ecosystem of everybody raising capital, venture capital specifically. So, there's kind of an expectation in terms of the type of business that you have when you're raising capital. And when you're having conversations with venture capitalists, they're looking for a very specific type of business. Now, I haven't raised capital since 2013. And when I did, I went through Draper University. So I was very clear about what needed to happen because I was in that ecosystem and immersed in those conversations on the daily. And it was a different type of business at the time that venture capitalists found acceptable, right? So fast forward 10 years later, when we first brought Framey into fruition, we started making money in the second month, third month, really, like month 2.5. And because of the way we were making money, we were attaching videographers to projects. When we started pitching, we got a lot of pushback because there's different types of businesses that venture capitalists find sexy or investable or venture backable, right? And so for me, the type of business that Framey was not one of those. So they looked at it as a service-based business. Now, when we think about service-based businesses, a lot of us as African Americans, Black people, people of color, we focus on service-based businesses, meaning we'll do hair or we'll send videographers out to projects or we'll consult or we'll do anything that it involves providing a service, which is not scalable, right? So when we think about a venture backable company, and this is a conversation that hasn't been had a lot, we're thinking about a company that can get to 100 million in revenue. And the reason why is because VCs raise money from limited partners or LPs. And by way of them raising this money, they have to return the fund, meaning they need to get a return for those investors. So the investors have investors type of situation. So the type of return is not a small return. In some cases, it could be a 10x return or a 10 times multiple. It could be 100x return, right? 100 times multiple. And so when you're thinking about a service-based business, it does not fit into that category. So traditionally for African Americans or people of color, we are building service-based businesses because it's very easy to get money very quickly, right? And so when I started having conversations with venture capitalists, they were like, yeah, this feels like a service-based business. And then finally, when I got out of that parameter or barrier, then it was like, this feels like a marketplace, which in essence, Framey was a marketplace in the beginning. And because it felt like a marketplace, marketplaces were in 10 years ago, right? So marketplaces would be your Ubers, your Airbnbs, your DoorDashes. Those were the hot companies 10 years ago. And because venture is predicting for the future or what's going to be viable in the next 10 years, having a marketplace today just was not interesting to the venture capitalists that I was pitching to, right? And I would hear all kind of pushback. I don't invest in marketplaces. This feels like a service-based business, things like that. And so we had to really understand, okay, if we are going after venture capital, if that is the type of a vehicle or investment mechanism that we want to attach our business to, we need to lean into what they find interesting, right? And it's almost by force because if you think about it, when you have a service-based business, how are you supposed to fund that business? Well, you have your initial startup capital, which is typically what is called bootstrap, your money. And that startup capital, needs to come from either you or your friends and family. Well, my friends and family were like, not trying to contribute, right? And I had just gotten laid off from Truist. So I'm living off this severance. So I'm running through this very quickly because when you're starting a business, especially when you're building from the ground up, you're investing into the business, right? So I'm running through my capital very, very quickly. And so I had to make some really hard decisions, even though I was having conversations with venture capitalists in Atlanta, New York, and Silicon Valley. I thought, hey, Atlanta seems to be this ecosystem, this tech epicenter that should be up and coming, right? That was my theory, all the things that I heard in the media. And when we started having conversations with VCs, that wasn't necessarily the case. Like there was a lot of gaps that still needed to be filled, right? So when we went to raise here, it was like, okay, well, we need a proven. Atlanta doesn't have a lot of capital. The Southeast doesn't have a lot of capital in comparison to a Silicon Valley because of the fact that it's just not dense. The capital's not dense here. It's in the Valley because that is essentially where venture capital started. So because of the capital density, it became they don't have the same risks tolerance that Silicon Valley has. So it became a conversation of, have you guys proven the model? We don't necessarily need a 100x return in Atlanta. Yes, we want to lean toward it, but we'll take a 10x return. Whereas in Silicon Valley, it's like we need a 100x return because we're raising these very, very large funds. And so a typical fund size out there could be anywhere from 50 million to billions of dollars if you're looking for like Andreessen Horowitz, the Sequoia Capital, like those type of funds, Tyro Global, right? But here in Atlanta, it's like, oh, okay, we've raised, a smaller fund. So we don't need the type of return that a Silicon Valley-based fund would need. And so you really need to just understand the metrics of why these funds are made up the way that they are and why they deploy capital the way that they do. And because of Atlanta and their risk tolerance, they were like, yeah, you need to prove out this model. Come to us when you have 10,000 monthly recurring revenue, 10,000 a month. Now, when I say monthly recurring revenue, venture capital is very much focused on predictable revenue. So going back to the marketplace, typically with a marketplace, you have transactions, right? So that transactions leads into a fee, but it's like a one-time purchase versus a recurring purchase. So that's what makes it not as sexy because they're looking for multiple purchases month over month because they can predict down to the numbers and how you scale the business if they're going to be able to exit with your company for the most part, if the math is mathing, right? So, I mean, none of it's true science, but they're backing into a number. So because of that, when you talk about a marketplace, they're looking at that one-time purchase and they can't look at the number and back into it because they don't know when the next purchase is going to come in. And so that is why it's not as sexy as a business in terms of your SaaS businesses, your software as a services that have subscriptions attached to them. And so those are two things we were dealing with. We were raising in Atlanta or the Southeast, and my co-founders in Kentucky. So we were raising there and we had a marketplace. So it just made it very, very difficult. We had so many no's, so much rejection, and nobody was telling us specifically why. We were just getting hints and like little nuances as to what was happening, but it wasn't like, hey, Sequoia, really, you just need to go back and build an enterprise vertical SaaS business that has very large margins and that we can predict the revenue. And that's it. So food for thought, if you are going to try to raise venture, enterprise SaaS, vertical SaaS is probably your best bet. So we're going through this process and we're really trying to understand. And then finally it clicked to Leif and I, okay, we need to, one, shift our strategy, our fundraising strategy, and focus on the Valley, right? And that's what I told Atlanta Constitutional Journal. It's like, I couldn't, because the Valley will take risks earlier. If you have a big idea and it has some type of traction, a little bit of market validation, you do not need the type of numbers that the Southeast wants you to have because of the risk tolerance. You can raise in the Valley quicker than you would be able to raise in the Southeast, unless you're part of an accelerator. And even then, they're still looking for some type of metric, right? So we went back to the Valley, to Silicon Valley, and we started having conversations with the accelerators out there. And we've joined a program called Founder University, which was created by Jason Calacanis. He is an early investor in Uber, considered a super angel investor, and still looking for the type of liquidity, those 100x returns. But because we are part of his program, he was able to look, or their team was able to look at our business and say, hey, actually, you need to think about this like this. And it wasn't in the sense of like, hey, if you're going to go after venture, it was more in the sense of like, to structure this business from the lens that we look at, you need to be thinking about it like this. So we were able to reshape the business, and for all intents and purposes, it is a better model for us to execute on, because when you're dealing with AI, you have very large margins, like you're paying against the tokens that are in the API, right? So you have extremely large margins. And then with that said, when you have SaaS, you have predictable revenue, right? So now it's a matter of proving out that model versus the marketplace model, because we had garnered a substantial amount of traction on the marketplace side. So now we need to focus on proving out that other model, or the SaaS model. And so I think that is just something to note and worth saying, depending on where you are in the region in the United States. If you're global, I'm not sure what your metrics look like. I've done a lot of stuff overseas, and a lot of the times I'm seeing a lot of government investments, which we don't do a whole lot of in the United States. If it is, it's through contracts or grants or government, contracts, things like that. So in terms of private equity, it's typically from a venture capitalist or some other funding vehicle. So that said, we're like, okay, we still need to figure out how to raise capital. So there's other gap that people don't talk about. And that gap is focused on your business that is a service-based business, right? And what are you supposed to do? Because you're not going to raise venture off of it. Forget about it. It's not even in their purview. They don't care. So what do you do? How do you get money for that business? So then that becomes a barrier to entry too, because you need to have at least 2 years in business to go to a bank to get a loan from a bank. And you need to be generating revenue, and you need to be having the taxes or the credit together for that business, and trade lines and all these things that like aren't talked about. I think it's honestly might be easier to raise venture than it is to get a loan at this point. But so you do that, right? There's a gap. Where is the early stage funding coming from? That is, to me, the bigger question, because typically for a VC that is not interested in a service-based business, what are you supposed to do? So I went and I explored a lot of different opportunities and options, and I looked into CDFIs, and CDFIs are essentially built to basically help minorities or underserved communities put capital into, or infuse capital into their businesses, right? There is an issue with these two, to be frank. Like when I got on a call with one of them, they were like, yeah, you can have a lower credit score. My credit score is like fluctuating. It's different depending on who you're talking to, but you can have a lower credit score, and you need to also collateralize your house. And I'm like, no. So surely because I just have been renting my entire life. I'm a single woman, and I didn't want to purchase until I was married, just because I don't want the upkeep, right? So like, I'm not going to collateralize my house. So I talked to my co-founder about it, and he's like, we're actually not going to collateralize our house either. So then there becomes that part is like, okay, well, you can have a lower credit score, which my credit score is not crazy low, but it's, it's not great because I've been back and forth entrepreneurship loans, all the things. So you can have a lower credit score, but you also need to put some type of collateral up for this. So then that becomes a barrier. So there's just so many barriers to entry depending on who you're talking to. You can obviously go for high net worth individuals, angel investors, but then you have to gain their trust. And we did attempt to have the conversations around angels in the midst of our funding journey. And if they don't understand venture and the way venture works, you got a whole nother animal on your hand, because you're going to have them asking you, okay, so when am I getting this return? And venture is a 7 to 10 year time horizon. It takes 7 to 10 years to get the kind of liquidity that a venture capitalist wants, because you're essentially needing to get to $100 million in revenue, which is valued at depending on where you're at. If your vertical SaaS is a 10 times return multiple, so $1 billion company, unicorn company. So I know that was a mouthful, but That takes 7 to 10 years in most cases, right? And now people aren't even liquidating. So that's a whole nother concern for the community. And they're like, okay, we're at year 10. Are you going to IPO? You're going to have an M&A, merger acquisition? What are you going to do? And people are like, no, I'm just going to stay here and chill. And they're like, we kind of need our money back. So there's liquidity issues, right? So it's just a whole mess. I say that's what I say this to say. Like, it's a whole mess. There's still a lot that needs to be figured out. From a business standpoint, it's very frustrating because there's so many barriers to entry. And for somebody like me who has had corporate jobs, who's gone through the gamut, there's also that barrier to entry. Like, if you tell them, hey, I'm going to go get a job, then VCs are like, well, we need you to work on the business full time. Okay, but how are we financing this? Or like, now I'm working on somebody's job, and they're like, but you work for us, so you shouldn't be working on another business. So creative financing, I guess, is the best way that you can possibly do it. I don't know what that means. I do not have the answers. We, have done everything that we could possibly do at Frame Me, and we're still pushing and we're still trying to figure it out. I will keep you guys posted in terms of what that looks like when we figure out what the solution is, because we actually do not have it yet. We're still going through the process of trying to understand what needs to happen. So I will definitely keep you guys abreast on that. But just to address the entire story with the Atlanta Constitutional Journal, I basically just said, hey, look, we have to raise in the valley. Like, I can't put my energy and efforts into Atlanta right now until at least we get to a Series A, which is a seed, or Series A, which is later in the company growth stage, because we're too new and Atlanta just does not have that risk tolerance. And so, yeah, so that is where we're at. That whole publication about the Fearless Fund is so unfortunate, because that is funding that could be going to our Black founders, right? Our Black women founders. And it's just not there anymore. So you are trying to really just, as an early stage company, figure it out. And I don't know that there are the solutions yet. I think they're still trying to figure out what that looks like. I don't want to get political, but I know that Kamala is doubling down in that space. She has visited Atlanta quite a bit and had those conversations with entrepreneurs in the city. So, I don't have the solution. I don't. And I will keep you guys posted in terms of what happens with Frame Me and how we end up unraveling this spider web. But yeah, keep it locked and come back, because I will get into a lot of other things that we've done to get ourselves to at least grow the company and really just mold into who we needed to be and where we needed to be, to just understand what makes this a viable business for Leif and I. So yeah, stay tuned.